And good morning. Welcome to the 19th Annual National Book Festival, which is officially and indisputably the best free event in Washington, and it's furthermore. And guess what? It's better than most of the ones you have to pay for. The Kluge Center, as Michael mentioned, I work at the Kluge Center, and we are proud to be sponsoring 3 of the events on the history stage, including this one. The center's mission at the library is to bridge the gap between scholarship and policymakers and the interested public by bringing leading thinkers in the humanities and social sciences to the library for periods of residence during which they use the library collections, and by showcasing the work of those scholars and other prominent writers in public events and in other forums. I want to highlight a few of the events that we will be hosting this fall that will be open to the public, including a conversation on the dynamics of the presidential primaries featuring Amy Walter and other scholars, complicity and accountability in the Great Recession, and leadership lessons from Presidents Lincoln and Grant with historian Ron White. Also, in conjunction with the Shall Not Be Denied exhibit, the center will host an event on 100 years of women voting, featuring Christina Wolbrecht and Jane Junn. Today, the library is honored to have Joanne Freeman at the National Book Festival for a conversation on her latest book, The Field of Blood: Violence in Congress and the Road to the Civil War. Freeman is professor of history and American studies at Yale. She comments on history and politics in many major media. She's the co-host of a popular history podcast, Backstory, and she appears frequently in documentaries on PBS and the History Channel. Her online course, The American Revolution, has been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people in homes and classrooms around the world. Please join me in welcoming Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joanne, how did you come up with the idea to write a book about fighting and dueling on the floor of the House and Senate in the 1800s?
It's not because I'm a naturally violent person, I will say. I guess I faced the problem that a lot of authors do, which is I actually didn't know what my next book was going to be about. My first book was about, essentially, it's affairs of honor. It was about what it felt like to be a national politician on the national stage in the first 10 years of the government. So I knew my next book was going to have something to do with politics and probably at least outrage, if not violence. And I knew that in 1838, one congressman killed another congressman in a duel. So not knowing what I was doing, I actually had a wonderful fellowship at the Library of Congress for 3 months, so thank you, Library of Congress, for allowing me to write this book. And I went to the papers of a congressman who was from the same state as the fellow who was killed, and I just started reading. And as luck would have it, he wrote almost every day to his wife, sometimes twice a day to his wife. And there was a lot of violence. He kept describing people rolling up their sleeves to throw a punch or actually punching. And I thought, well, I had this vague sense that there was violence there, but there's sure a lot more here than I thought I'd seen. So in the 3 months that I was at the Library of Congress, I don't think I ever opened the papers of a congressman without finding at least one violent incident. And so then obviously my job became, what does this mean? You know, why haven't we seen it before in this way? And what does it mean that there was all this violence there?
So, you know, what's interesting is that you told the story from the perspective, at least part of the story, from the perspective of someone who was not a congressman, Benjamin Brown French. Who was he, and why was he a key figure in this period?
When I was writing the book, I kind of thought that people would assume I made him up because he's such a wonderful character. So yeah, he's not in Congress. He's a clerk, and he's the clerk for 2 years, but generally speaking, he's just a clerk, so a minor clerk in the House. What's wonderful about him is he left behind an 11-volume diary, and it's not the kind of diary that says, had lunch with Mr. Smith, walked home at 3 o'clock. He puts everything in there. And among the things that he put in there was some of the fighting. But in addition, he talks a lot in his diary about his feelings about what was going on. And what became important to me in this book is that the book tells the story of violence, but what I really wanted to get to was what was the emotional logic of that? How did Americans learn to turn on each other in this time period. And by looking through his eyes and his diary, he kind of enabled me to do that. He also happens to be like the Forrest Gump of
Exactly, yeah.
the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. If something important happened, somehow or other, Benjamin Brown French was there, and so he's footnoted all over the place because I thought no one's going to believe that he was there.
Wasn't he next to Lincoln in some important historical?
He was at the bedside after the assassination.
Yep, that's that.
He was holding John Quincy Adams' hand not long after he had a stroke in the House of Representatives. Someone tries to assassinate Andrew Jackson. Who's there watching? Benjamin Brown French. Gettysburg Address. Who's up on the stage right near Lincoln? Benjamin Brown French. I even found a picture of that one. So
yeah, she's got that picture is in the book.
Yeah. So he's amazing. Amazing because of where he was, but even better for me, amazing because he put so many of his feelings down in his diary.
So the story the stories are told vividly in the book, but in the realm of understatement, you wrote, quote, "Everyday business in Congress had rough edges," end quote. There was less of a veneer of civility in the antebellum Congress. Go there a little bit. Like, how is it different than we see today? We don't think of Congress as being overwhelmingly civil today, but
this is another scale. Yeah, this is true. And I should say, in part, it reflects what the United States was like in this time period, right? Because the United States was a violent place. There was constant rioting. There were election riots. People died routinely during elections. There was all kinds of violence, just the institution of slavery all by itself, how the United States treated Native Americans. So there was rampant violence in this period. And so in Congress, in some way, you could say that Congress was being representative when it was being violent.
Yep.
But more than that, part of what I found early on in the process of writing the book that I found really interesting was Southerners were more likely to be armed, were more willing to engage in man-to-man combat, and use that advantage in Congress to get what they wanted, often to protect the institution of slavery. And what that meant was there was a lot of intimidation and violence that was Southerners aimed at Northerners, and by violence, that means real violence. It means pulling knives, Bowie knives, pulling guns on each other, engaging in fistfights, flipping desks, mass brawls, canings, and everything else that you can imagine. Was going on more often in the floor of the House. The Senate tended towards duel challenges more than anything else. But still, a lot of physical violence going on in this.
So you found all this in the Congressional Record, right?
I did not find this in the Congressional Record.
So what was in the Congressional Record that corresponded to when some of the fun stuff was happening?
Yeah, so this was one of the big challenges, and actually it helps answer the question, why hasn't this story really been told in this way before? The Congressional Record, for the most part, unless there was a huge brawl, didn't tend to talk about this. The Congressional Record says things like, the debate became unpleasantly personal at one point. And in one case, someone pulled a gun on someone else, and that is unpleasantly personal. In another case, it says something like, there was a sudden sensation in the corner. And in that case, two congressmen got into a fist fight, and they flipped over their desk in the course of having the fist fight. So it took me researching in private letters and diaries to find a lot of the violence. Then when I went to the record, I discovered, oh, it's there. It's just kind of buried beneath these cryptic statements.
Yeah, so you talked about the difference in the approach of Northerners and Southerners, or in the ethic with respect to violence in Northerners and Southerners. Go into that a little bit more detail, if you would, and also whether that gave one side or the other an advantage politically.
Sure. Now, one of the really interesting things that I discovered early on is not only did the Southerners have this advantage of being more willing to engage in man-to-man combat and more likely to be armed, but that was notorious. And they had, at the time in Congress, and actually probably wider than Congress, phrases that they used to describe the kinds of people who were more likely to fight and the kinds of people who were less likely to fight. They actually broke their ranks down into, this is their phrases, fighting men and non-combatants, which tells you something about this topic, that it was pretty immediate for them. So they were fighting men who were notorious for being ready and willing to engage in combat, and non-combatants who were notorious for not wanting to do that. That line broke down, as I'm suggesting, into Southern and Northern. And what that meant when it came to slavery is that not only were Southerners represented to an extra degree because of the 3/5 compromise that gave at least some enslaved people, they were counted in the representation calculations, but in addition to that, there was kind of a cultural clout that Southerners used to their advantage, again, to protect the institution of slavery by threatening and intimidating non-combatants and people who were less willing to fight.
So I found very interesting in the book that you covered John Quincy Adams a lot, and he's distinctive for a lot of reasons that probably most folks know. But he was an old guy, so he wasn't going to be fighting, but he still was pretty good. I mean, he still was effective. So how did he pull that? Because the non-combatants, you're suggesting the non-combatants in the North were the ones maybe who were steamrolled politically, but not Adams.
No, Adams, so what's wonderful about Adams, so John Quincy Adams, he goes to the House after his presidency, which all by itself is fascinating.
Right.
But by the time he does that, so he's an ex-president, he's the son of an ex-president and a founder, and he's elderly by that point. So there was a sort of triple whammy. You were not going to slug John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams knew that, and he totally used it to his advantage. So he knew that he could step forward and really challenge the Southerners. I think at one point he says, if you think the shoe pinches now, just wait. And so he basically went in his seat in the House and did this, right? Just bring it. And people, there's his most persistent attacker is a fellow named Henry Wise of Virginia. And Henry Wise at one point says, and this actually is in the record, if you weren't who you are, you would feel more than my words. And Adams, in his diary that night, writes, Henry Wise threatened me today. Said he was going to kill me if he could, So he was quite aware of what he was doing, but because of that, he knew that he could step forward and really advocate for the anti-slavery cause. So he had a power. Add that to the fact that he was brilliant at parliamentary maneuvering, and he was a real force to be reckoned with.
What was a doughface?
So a doughface was a Northerner, usually a Northern Democrat, who essentially was willing to do anything to appease Southerners, partly for the sake of their party, partly for the sake of the Union, on the issue of slavery. So doughface, it sounds like an insult, and it was meant to be an insult. Essentially, you're someone who's, wimpy and willing to appease rather than to confront this difficult issue of slavery. And Benjamin Brown French was a doughface.
Yeah, a New Hampshire guy. Your coverage of the controversies around the gag rule it struck me as important, because in that case, am I right? I mean, the tactics of the Southerners to try to use intimidation to get their way backfired a little bit.
Right.
You could go into that a little bit, explain what the gag rule is, and
sure.
So how that ended up, some of their intimidation tactics maybe didn't work in this case.
It's true, but for a very particular reason. So in the 1830s, the American Anti-Slavery Society began really pushing a petition, an anti-slavery petition campaign, and hundreds and thousands of petitions were being sent to Congress. So it really had an impact. And because of that, particularly the House, which had to come up with rules every time there was a new House, had to figure out what to do about these petitions. One person at the time actually said, what's the right thing to do for these petitions that people are sending, basically saying Southerners are barbarians, Southerners are horrific human beings? Well, you can do two things. You can silence them or you can knock them down. And so they opted, in this case, for the silencing mode of operating, and they essentially tabled anti-slavery petitions, meaning that they, just what it suggests, sort of put them off to the side and decided not to act on them in the case of these petitions. Now, the idea behind that was to stifle that discussion, and I think they probably thought to silence some of the debate and the angst and the anger and the anxiety in Congress over the issue of slavery, but it actually, in the end, did the precise opposite, partly because of people like John Quincy Adams, who knew Americans might not in the North, and it's Northerners obviously whose petitions are being stifled, that Northerners might not be really upset about the issue of slavery, but they would be darned upset if their right of petition was being really cut back. So Adams, after a time, really focused on that angle and essentially said over and over and over again, Northerners, your right to petition the government is being compromised here, knowing that would feel like self-interest to Northerners, and they would respond that way, which they did. Mm-hmm. And so in the end, rather than silencing this issue down, it actually really roused the North and created more of a fuss. The two most violent the two most violent moments in Congress are, not surprisingly, the handful of years before the Civil War and the gag rule years. Mm-hmm. So it did the opposite of whatever it was intended to do.
So let's get to the UFC part of the program now. Let's think about some of the fights. The first one that I thought would be interesting for people to hear about is the duel between Representatives Silly and Graves.
Right. So it's a duel, takes place in 1838. That's actually the only thing I knew when I started the book was, oh, there was that duel in 1838 where one congressman kills another. So Jonathan Silly is from Maine. William Graves is from Kentucky. The interesting thing about the duel, and the reason I focused on it, is they actually had no real issue with each other. What happens is that Henry Wise, who's just the troublemaker basically, comes into the House with a newspaper and stands up and says, I have evidence here that Democrats, and in particular one Democrat, is corrupt. That Democratic Party is a corrupt party. And Silly, who's a Democrat, stands up and says, I resent that. Now, Henry Wise is a Southerner, and this is a great example of what fighting men did to silence Northerners. He very slowly and dramatically turns around to look at Silly and says, are you saying I'm lying? And that's a dueling prequel, right? Which Silly knows, and Silly says, no, I'm not saying you're lying, but that's really not true, that the Democrats are corrupt. Hem, haw, right? It's kind of an awkward moment. Wise pushes it for a little while, then says something nasty about Silly to humiliate him, and that moment passes. But in the course of that debate, Silly insults a newspaper editor, and the newspaper editor comes riding down to Washington to defend his name. What was interesting about this to me was that in the end, Silly ends up fighting the friend of the newspaper editor who was just transmitting letters back and forth. They liked each other fine. They had no problem with each other. The fight really was between Silly and this editor. But the pull of violence and the pull of dueling and the importance of defending your reputation kind of sucks both of these unfortunate men into being involved in a duel against each other, which ends up being a fatal duel. And it's one of the remarkable things about it is because one congressman kills another, there's a congressional investigation, there's a big, long report in which they really interrogated every single person that had anything to do with the duel or its arrangements or its aftermath. And so as a historian, what was amazing about that was you have eyewitness testimony from everyone who had anything to do with that duel. And so unlike most duels which happen and sometimes you'll get a really cursory account of what went on, in this case, you get every detail.
Since somebody died.
Well, since someone died, and then since there was this committee and people testified.
Yeah. And so when I was reading it, I was like, the duel didn't look the way I thought it would look.
How did you think it would look?
Well, I thought it would, you imagine what's done on stage, Burr and Hamilton, or they take 10 steps and they turn around and miss or hit or whatever. It's not really like that, right?
No. In a way, it's worse, right? Because the two parties are positioned. They agree in advance how far apart they'll be. In this case, they were very far apart. Nobody thought anyone was going to get killed in this because they were so far apart. But they stand facing each other with their weapons, and predetermined, one of the 2 seconds or sort of assistants in the duel says 1, 2, 3, present, and then they have 3 seconds to fire. And in this particular case, neither man was very good with a gun. And they didn't they had liked each other fine. They didn't have any issue with each other, right? So they're bad shots. Silly needed glasses. The whole thing. Graves' friends came with blankets because they thought they were going to have to carry his body back from the ground because there was no way they assumed he could hit anybody with a gun. So the first time, Silly misfires, and they have another round of firing, and this time Graves misfires, and he does so embarrassingly that he says, well, I need another shot. So there's a third exchange of fire, and that's unfortunately when Graves kills Silly, who's shot and immediately basically dies on the ground. And what you get when you look at this congressional report is all the ways in which they were, I think in addition to thinking that duelists sort of stalk away from each other and then turn around and very dramatically fire, you assume that everyone knows exactly what they're doing, and they don't.
And then they negotiate between rounds.
They negotiate.
They have all these the corner men, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah,
sort of come in and try and figure out, can we end it now? And there's a farmer's kid who's like talking to Graves in between shots, saying, "Is this over something you guys said in Congress? Like, why are you guys dueling?" So you get every level of detail, but you really see the degree to which no one really wanted this to happen. And yet it did, with such a fatal outcome. So that, to me, it was a great example of the many ways in which it was sometimes hard to avoid this level of violence.
What was the deal between, because you said senators aren't necessarily as, well, they're more likely to duel, but they weren't having as many fights. But there was an important fight between Senators Benton and Foote. What was important about that?
So this is in 1850. And Thomas Hart Benton and Henry Foote, that was what ends up being the compromise of 1850s being debated at that moment. By that point, the issue of slavery, partly because of the ongoing Western expansion of the United States, is really becoming heated. In this case, the compromise of 1850, people really weren't quite sure how that was going to get hashed out. Benton and Foote are on opposite sides of this debate. They had a different sense of how the compromise should be made. Foote was, I think, just an irritable and irritating human being. There's a lot, it's not very hard to find people saying nasty things about Henry Foote, basically, as a historian. So Foote wanted to humiliate and discredit Benton. Benton was willing to compromise in some ways on slavery. Foote was not. So Foote, again and again and again, kept trying to find ways to publicly, on the floor of the Senate, humiliate Benton. And then finally, one day, Benton just snaps and throws back his chair, sort of throws the table back. Someone in the gallery says they heard glass smashing, the pitcher came off the table, and he ran at Foote. Now, Foote knew that sooner or later bad things were going to happen, so he had armed himself. And so what happens in this instance is that Benton runs towards Foote, and Foote pulls a gun, this is on the floor of the Senate, and aims it at Benton. So this causes chaos. Right, and they're running towards Foote and they're running towards Benton, and there's a cartoon of it that shows people running from the galleries and women throwing their parasols, and it's a moment. But it's a moment that really shows you how fraught things were, even in this case, between two people who are not Northerners, between two people who are Southerners on the issue of slavery. What's interesting about that moment is, among other things, it happens, nothing happens, someone grabs the gun from Foote, puts it in his desk, they sit down, someone actually says, well, now that that's done, let's get back to work. And someone stands up, actually a New Hampshire senator stands up and says, before we get back to work, I hope you all realize in this room that because of the telegraph, within 45 minutes, the nation is going to be hearing that we're slaughtering each other here in the Senate. And there's nothing we can do about it. The telegraph was a new form of technology at this moment. And there you can see Congress grappling with a new form of technology that sped up the way that political communication happens. The telegraph moment in the early 1850s is the equivalent of our social media moment now, in which there's a form of technology that complicates the conversation of democracy between people and politicians. And there you can see the politicians basically trying to grapple with that fact.
But the public is expressing its interest in reasoned debate and So what's more exciting for them? Somebody calling the people a name, or is it, let's talk seriously about transportation or something?
You mean it's the public being all civil while the congressmen are being?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So
yeah, no.
The interplay there is, so they're being responsive, representative.
Well, exactly.
Right.
So there's kind of a vicious circle of angst, of anxiety and hostility. You have members of Congress saying things to rouse their constituents. You have the press reporting that with increasing speed and efficiency because of new technologies. You have the public responding by basically saying to their members of Congress, fight for our rights, and then congressmen responding to that. So you end up really, you can see how this anger and anxiety kind of builds on itself. That's part of what I was trying to do in the book, was to say it's not just a bunch of guys in 2 rooms in the Capitol, that what we're talking about here is a national conversation that's partly facilitated by the press.
You know, the famous fight that a lot of people know about is Preston Brooks versus Charles Sumner, not resulting in a death, but coming close. And that was in the 1850s, right?
That was in 1856, yeah. So that's the one that everyone knows. You know, it took me 17 years to write this book. And in the 17 years that it took me to write the book, if I said to people I'm writing a book about physical violence in Congress, inevitably they would say, there was that guy. I was like, yes, this guy, Charles Sumner. They didn't always know the name, but they knew about the caning of Sumner. Yeah. So that is the one instance people know about. I think many people assume that's the only violent incident. I found about 70 over the course of my research in the House and Senate. What's distinctive about this one is partly it comes about after a series of incidents in which Southerners are attacking Northerners, and partly because both men, in a sense, violate the rules of combat, which I know sounds rather insane to think that there are rules of fighting, but there were. So, for example, Preston Brooks, you know, you're not supposed to stage a deliberate caning of that sort in the House. You're supposed to do that on the street. So, I know, how civil of them, I can hear you thinking to yourself. Brooks, for 2 days, waited outside the Capitol building trying to catch Sumner on his way in so that he would stage this in the way that it was supposed to take place. It was only when he couldn't that he said, oh, to heck with it, I'm just going to go in and cane him on the floor. What happens afterwards shows you why that was something to be avoided. The power of that, of a Southerner caning a Northern anti-slavery senator to the ground in the Senate chamber, that had a huge power.
And
so,
yeah, I was going to say, and Sumner he was in people's face as an abolitionist,
well, and precisely,
in a way that a lot of them weren't, right?
Precisely, and so Southerners said afterwards, well, the way he spoke about us, he was basically asking for, or I think it's Stephen Douglas who says, some damn idiot's going to attack that damn idiot, and he's kind of asking for it, you know, that if you speak in that aggressive a manner, that to some Southerners that was basically asking for some form of retribution.
And then there was around that time, actually a little bit later, right? There was the Congressman KITT versus Grow. I mean, that was the Civil War right there, right?
Well, right. That's a
real precursor to the Civil War.
So that's in 1858. That was a fascinating fight to uncover. It takes place in 1858. It's during an evening session. Evening sessions are notoriously bad. There's almost always a fight because congressmen go out to dinner and they drink, and then they come back into Congress. So bad things happen in evening sessions. And in this case, Galusha Grow, which I just love that name because it's such a wonderful 19th century name. Galusha Grow from Pennsylvania is standing amidst some Southerners. Someone objects to something, and Grow says, you know, just let's keep going with what's going on here. He says something to object to what's going on in the room, but he's standing amidst Southerners. So Lawrence KITT, who's a South Carolinian and had apparently something to drink with dinner, is not happy that there's a Northerner standing amidst Southerners objecting, and he says, go back to your own side of the house and object. And Grow, who was a fighting man, said, I'm not going to listen to the words of some slave-driving Southerner. This is a free house. I can do whatever I want. At which KITT stands up, apparently muttering to himself, we'll see about that, and comes right up to Grow, grabs his collar to throw a punch. But Grow responds first, and he floors KITT. He punches him, and he knocks him flat. At that moment, Southerners who saw what happened begin to stream across the house, partly to break up the fight, partly to join into the fight. Northern Republicans who see what's going on begin jumping over tables and chairs in their haste to get to what's going on, again, partly to save their comrade in arms, or not in arms, but almost. And you end up with a huge brawl with dozens of congressmen in the space before the speaker's platform, just engaged in a mass brawl, huge, you know, punching each other and throwing things at each other. I mean, it's massive. In some ways, it's comical because it's a bunch of middle-aged congressmen, like, sort of running at each other and, like, you know, pulling on each other's vests. But, you know, people at the time, there's a reporter at the time who says, you know, that was a group of armed men from 2 different sides, North and South, running at each other in the House of Representatives and fighting. That was a battle. And that just sort of sends a chill right? If reporters said something was different about that fight, it was a fight of North against South. It was an armed battle of North against South on the floor of the House. We're going in an ugly direction.
So the last topic I want to get into, and people can, if you're interested in asking a question, can queue up. But the last question I wanted to ask Joanne is just kind of your general thoughts about the relevance, the patterns you saw there. Did you see parallels at other times? I mean, as an historian, parallels in other times in U.S. history, or even possibly today, to some of the things that were happening then?
I can hear you laughing, I know. So at a certain point, it took me a really long time to write the book. When I started writing the book 17 years ago, we were in a very different place politically. Over the years, it became clear I'm writing a book about extreme polarization, splintering political parties, growing distrust in national institutions of all kinds, conspiracy theories in the press. You could check off a list and say that there are many ways in which what we're experiencing now has some similarities to what I'm talking about in the book. But I think when you take, I'll be very historian-esque now, I think when you take a big step back and you look over the long haul of American history, what you see is, I think there are moments, key moments, and history doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes and definitely teaches. There are moments when I think a key issue is under debate, that people recognize as being a key issue about what America is. And those kinds of debates become super polarizing, hyper polarizing, and you end up with that sort of checklist of things that I just mentioned. So in the 1790s, in the late 1790s, that's a period of dirty, nasty politics. They're violent, they're conspiracy theories, and the debate at that moment was how democratic a republic was this republic going to be. In the 1850s, the issue at stake, obviously, is slavery and what its place will or won't be in the American nation. I would say the 1960s is another one of those moments, and civil rights are really what's up for debate. And I think now we're having another one of those moments, and what's up for debate is citizenship. And so it makes sense that those kinds of moments are polarizing. Of course, they're all different, so what you can't do is look back at these other moments and say, well, this happened that time, so here's what we should do this time. But what you can see is at least you can gain an understanding of why, to some degree, why the moment that we're in is so fraught and people are so engaged with it. Because I think people understand, as they did with these other debates, that there's something really fundamental that's at stake.
And there were, in all of those periods, there were media innovations that were either brand new or close to it, right?
Precisely.
That may have, fed the fire a bit, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, newspapers certainly weren't new in the 1790s, but they were really taking off with a real power in the partisan press. The Telegraph in the 1850s. TV in the civil rights era really brought home to people in their living room, literally, what was going on. And now social media. And it makes perfect sense that that's the case, because a democratic mode of politics is about politicians and the public engaging in some kind of a dialogue. It makes perfect sense that a form of technology that shapes or alters that dialogue is going to scramble a democratic politics.
And getting back to Forrest Gump, Mr. French, he always tried to find a middle ground, but in that period, it became increasingly difficult, right?
Right. And what's fascinating about him is, so he starts out in his diary, literally, I will do anything to appease the South, anything to appease the South, whatever I have to do. And over the course of the book, you watch him almost get dragged into a place where he can't say that anymore, where he's feeling more and more like, what are these Southerners doing? What do they want? Why won't they compromise? And ultimately he begins to feel betrayed, and then he begins to feel angry, so that even someone who's as moderate as he is for such a long amount of time, ultimately in the 1850s, he can't be that moderate person anymore. He's offended, he's defensive, and even he then at that point turns on Southerners as being betrayers who are un-American. And again, that's something that you see in these polarized moments. People go to that space, and once you've othered the other side to the point that they're un-American, that's a dangerous.
Yeah, and the consequences were huge. It was a matter of union or not.
Right.
And that's why he tried to find anything to keep the Union together, and then it became, in his view, impossible at some point.
Well, right, and what kind of union? And at a certain point,
Right.
it's, am I going to allow for this kind of union, or am I going to just, will I allow disunion to happen? And French ultimately gets to a point where, so here's an example of how French was so wonderful to me, right? At a point in the book, late in the book, his diary gets a little bit less juicy in his later years, and I was trying to write about what he feels about disunion, and I'm shuffling through the diary, and I'm looking through, he had a newspaper column, and he had an extensive correspondence, and I'm looking, and I can't find anything, and I'm like, French, give me something on disunion. He wrote a poem about disunion. So I got to understand what he felt about disunion by citing, who writes a poem about disunion, right? Benjamin Brown French wrote a poem about disunion.
So if you have a question, there's mics along in both of the aisles, if you could. So we'll start with the gentleman to my right.
Thank you very much. It's easy to read 19th century American history as a period of extraordinary violence. My question really goes to, social manners and cultural manners and etiquette. Is it possible that violence in that time and place was less lethal, was rarely lethal? Indeed, most duels, no one was hurt. It was perhaps a matter of honor to engage in the duel, but combination of technology and perhaps cooperation between the duelists often didn't result in a death.
That's a wonderful question.
Thank you for that question.
And so, is it the nature of violence? Violence was less violent?
Yes, I mean, that's a wonderful question.
Yep. Thank you.
If you're in a violent culture, or if you're in a place where there's likely to be violence, you actually are more likely to have rules of violence to keep it in certain channels. And so they actually, even as they were doing this behavior that I'm describing in Congress, there were rules about how you should or shouldn't behave. So for example, if you're going to insult a man, you should do it while he's present and not when he's absent, so that he can defend himself in whatever way he chooses. And when someone stood up and insulted someone who wasn't there, he got reprimanded. So you're absolutely right that a large part of the violence and the intimidation was for impact more than blood. They weren't out for blood. I mean, if you think about it, these Southerners weren't trying to dissolve Congress, they were trying to get what they wanted. And so the question was, what did they need to do to get what they wanted? So yeah, they don't want to draw blood, except for, I suppose, a few crazy individuals perhaps who did, but generally speaking, they're trying to have an impact. So yeah, I think if the violence is open in that way, it's going to be more rule-bound, because that's going to be the way that you're going to be able to play with it and deploy it to get what you want.
Sir?
I'd like to follow up on that. So was that impact a personal impact based on personal honor, or was there any sense of, I'll look great to my constituents if I take on this northern rascal?
That's a great question.
It's an excellent question, and that's particularly part of what interested me about this project. It's both. So on the one hand, very much, these people are performing before a national audience, they're performing before their colleagues and peers, they're performing before their families and friends. So they certainly, a congressman engaged in some kind of fights, worried about his personal reputation, but very much he's worried about what his constituents are going to think as well. So for example, Jonathan Silly of Maine, he, in my book I call it the Northern Congressman's Dilemma. He's stuck, because on the one hand he says, I don't want to get involved in a duel. I don't want to fight a duel. I don't want to have anything to do with it. My constituents think dueling is some barbaric Southern custom. On the other hand, if I back down, I'm going to look cowardly, and I'm going to humiliate my constituents, and I'm going to make them look bad because my reputation is bound up with theirs. So I have to, in the end, he decides to engage with this because he's worried about the impact of his actions on his constituents and what they'll think of him. So that's part of what's really interesting about what's going on in Congress in this period. It's part of what intrigued me, is that nothing that happens in that room is only happening in that room, right? I mean, some things are happening behind the scenes, but if it's happening on the floor and receiving any kind of coverage, it's getting a national impact in some way. Congress was really, to a greater degree than now, covered in the press. The majority of column inches in newspapers were about Congress in this period, not the president. So both of those things were true, and that makes politics really fraught and tricky in this time period.
Thank you.
Sir?
the periods that you talked about and the changes that came about because of technology and all that, and you've used the word about congressmen performing, how does a performing president change the venue?
Well, let me put it this way. Let's talk about Andrew Jackson. And I say that because Andrew Jackson, was a first president of a type, sort of fellow who saw himself as a man of the people in a very aggressive kind of a way, and who was a very aggressive, sort of definitely a fighting man individual who tended to goad his fellow congressmen who supported him to attack congressmen who didn't support him. So, in his case, and he was in some cases putting on a performance. In some cases his sort of wild, angry Andrew Jackson was, now it's time for me to be wild, angry Andrew Jackson, and now everyone's left the room and I can sit down and stop being wild, angry Andrew Jackson. But there's a case, for example, there were two, actually Henry Wise is one of them. There were two congressmen who end up being very much anti-Jackson. And Jackson, in a room full of people, a few years before, one of his supporters, actually Sam Houston, had violently caned a congressman who opposed Jackson to the ground in the street. So now, a couple years later, Jackson's in a room full of people. He's talking about Henry Wise and another fellow who he really hates. And he says to this room full of people, someone needs to Houstonize them. Now, right, I love the mix of laughter and ooh, right? On the one hand, he made up a word all by itself that was like, really? He just coined that phrase. On the other hand, he literally was asking someone in that room to attack these two congressmen who immediately went and armed themselves because they knew exactly what that meant. So, the presidency, in this period, the presidency in the 19th century, it's in a different place institutionally than it is now, but it's certainly part of the mix. And when at the time you had a president like Jackson, who sort of put himself in the fray in that way, it had an impact.
Sir?
I'm curious when all this stopped, when it became, out of bounds for this sort of violence to go on.
Good question.
Certainly, obviously, this wasn't the last time there were really fundamental questions before Congress about what the country is.
Yeah, Joanne addressed that in the book.
As to when it stopped, the question is, when is it no longer really the case that this violence is acceptable?
Right.
Well, yeah, so what's interesting about that, I do talk about that in the epilogue, because that's a question when I was working on the book that everybody asked, which is, so then what happens after the war? And interestingly, the first state or two that tries to get back into the Union, they send people to Washington. These men are very sort of proud and high-strung and very resentful about the sort of tone of the conversation. So there's two, I believe, Louisiana congressmen who end up attacking Northerners in the Capitol building. One of them actually canes someone not in the Senate, but within the Capitol building. What's fascinating about that is the response, and this is part of the answer to your question. Northerners who hear of this in the House and Senate basically say, do we want to let them back into the Union? Do you all remember what it was like here in the 1850s? Because that's what we're seeing again. The power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that what used to really have clout did not have clout in that way anymore. And you can see that in the response to those little outbursts of violence. And after that point, in a sense, violence shifts to local areas. Violence of Southerners turns on the South. Right, then you get Reconstruction violence, you have violence and control being asserted on a different battlefield of sorts.
Yes.
Hi, I have a historian process question. I was interested in when you said the official record was less help on this topic than private diaries. So how did you find them, especially for non-famous people?
Yeah.
We have a family tradition of some Civil War correspondence, which, boy, I'd love to get my hands on that. Where are they?
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. First off, non-famous people are sometimes the best people to find. In the case of this book, I had 3 months at the Library of Congress. So I just literally marched my way through. I had lists of congressmen, and I just marched my way through. What was key in the end was triangulating, right? So it was a matter of, first of all, seeing who had diaries. Diaries were sometimes the best. Letters to wives were also among the best evidence, because men would admit all kinds of fears and thoughts and feelings to their wives that they wouldn't admit anywhere else. But it was a little, in the beginning, needle in a haystack-ish kind of research, really. And it was that kind of research in combination with really rummaging through databases. I couldn't have done this project without huge newspaper databases, and the fact that the equivalent of the Congressional Record in the period also is all online. So, I mean, it's remarkable. I had to do a lot of archival research and digging to find one little incident here and there, but I could sit at my desk, read the equivalent of the record, go to a newspaper database to see the newspaper coverage of what I'd just seen, go to Google Books and look for the memoir or autobiography of someone who was there at the time to see what he said, all at my desk. I mean, that was not the case with my first book by a long shot. So it was a combination of really strategic database deployment and being willing to rummage around with the, I mean, there's a reason why it took me 17 years to write this book, right? Is that there was a lot of rummaging. The fact of the matter is, I adore that kind of research, right? That's my nirvana as a scholar, is to be with the stuff and dig around and see what I can find, because you really never know what you're going to find. So that part of it made me happy.
Hi, 2 questions, and I hope you'll answer both. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, in his one term in Congress, did he witness or was he involved in any of these things, 1? And 2, before he was famous, James Shields, a judge, he almost got in a duel with James Shields, a judge, who later was senator for 3 different states, on an island no longer exists in the Mississippi River called Bloody Island, and chose broad shores, etc. Can you give insights into either of those aspects of our greatest American yet to live's life?
I can, and they're going to be frustratingly brief insights.
Okay.
Lincoln certainly saw some of this, but he didn't take part in any of it. And I had to restrict what I was looking at to things that took place in Washington when Congress was in session, because if I let myself go beyond that, I would still be working on this book. There's just too much violence. So I pretty much had to stay focused, had to rein myself in still to a vast topic, but I couldn't go beyond the bounds of Washington.
Was he present in any of the incidents that was in your book, Field of Blood?
Was Lincoln?
Yeah, Lincoln, did he witness anything in person?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there was not a session of Congress where there wasn't violence. Yep. So he certainly would have.
Let's get to this next question, sir.
Yes. Yes. I have been shown a bullet hole in a desk in the House of Representatives. I wonder if you know the story behind that bullet hole, and is it in your book?
Wow. I only know, in the period that I wrote about, so the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, I only know of one gun going off in the House. And in that case, it went through the door of the House and hit a Capitol police officer in the leg, who, of course, was a close friend of Benjamin Brown French. And I'm not even joking. But I don't know the story of that desk, so I don't know.
Thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions if they're super quick.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for speaking. I came in a few minutes late, so you'll have to forgive me if you've already touched on this. My question relates to the topic of gender. More specifically, how has the increase in the number of women in Congress impacted topics of violence and disagreement from the period of the Civil War and more recently from the Civil Rights era?
It's a great question.
Well, certainly in this period, there was a kind of a mixed response to the presence or absence of women. So sometimes when some bad moment was happening on the floor, sometimes the people engaged in it would actually pause and look up at the galleries to see how many women were present, and sometimes tone it down. On the other hand, really nasty congressmen would sometimes look up in the gallery to be sure that the wife of the person they were about to attack was there, so that then they could humiliate him even more. So sometimes having a woman present was, it's almost a cliche, a taming influence. Sometimes it wasn't. And the fact of the matter is, not everything was happening in Congress. Boarding houses, there was stuff going on. Women were there in the boarding houses as well. So they were part of this debate, and their presence or absence had something to do with what went on. As a matter of fact, interestingly, Preston Brooks, when he went to Sumner, he goes into the Senate, and there was a woman in the room, and he sat down and waited for her to leave. before he caned Sumner. And he apparently sat there, and a friend came in and saw him like in a chair just kind of gazing at this woman and walked over to him and said, "She's rather attractive, isn't she?" And Brooks said something along the lines of, "Yes, I wish she would leave." You know, so he wasn't going to do what he did in front of another woman. Obviously, over time, that changes dramatically. One of the things that's happening in this period is that you're getting women reporters to a greater degree. Actually, the first woman in the official press gallery, she's there the day that Foote pulls a gun on Benton by chance and writes an account of it, which is not any, dramatically different from anyone else's account, but of course she's attacked for being hysterical and emotional and all of the things that would be said of a woman doing anything publicly, yeah. So obviously that changes tremendously over time. In this period, it's kind of equivocal.
So I think we need to wrap it up now, and I just want to thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
We appreciate
Thank
it very
you.
much.
Thank you.